Terrance Wilson graduated from the University of Washington and Seattle University Law School and is the owner of Wilson Law Group. His practice focuses on real estate development and the various legal issues affecting developers, property owners, and consultants in the Seattle area. Hello, Terry. Welcome, and thanks for coming on with us today.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Great. Well, you have a unique background. I know you're an attorney, but in your past life too, you were also a planner and you had a survey firm. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I got involved in the real estate industry back in 1996, working for my father-in-law who owned a land surveying company. And within a few years, developed a real interest in the planning side of things, took over the company, and decided to go to law school in the evenings while running the survey business by day.
Great. Well, that kind of makes you uniquely positioned to kind of talk about the topic today. And one thing we keep hearing about is lack of affordability of housing and diversity of housing in and around the Puget Sound region. So, I mean, do you have any, personal stories or background on talking about that? What are your clients or what have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, it's astonishing just in the time from 96 to today, watching what's happening to pricing and availability, and particularly these last couple of years here. It's pricing out a lot of people from being able to buy housing, especially any new housing, anywhere near the city of Seattle or greater Puget Sound area. But I grew up in the Skyway area near Renton High School, where I went to high school, and so that area I've seen over the years. A lot of folks have been displaced and pushed out even further out into other suburbs, and kind of a loss of a sense of community has happened. Gentrification, a lot of things that, as I've done surveying and now real estate law, watching all the development go on, there's a sort of side story about a lot of families and historical generational communities that have been affected by just the unavailability of affordable housing. And so this topic today is an exciting one for me because I think it helps. There's no perfect solution to everything, but it helps meet some of those needs.
You're right. And while there's no silver bullet to solving the housing crisis, the discussion around ADUs and DADUs small houses might be part of the discussion. So, first of all, help us understand what is the difference between an ADU, DADU, tiny home. Help us with that.
Yeah, you hear a lot of words tossed around: cottage housing, ADUs, DADUs. To get the lay of the land, the city of Seattle and some of the other jurisdictions, particularly Kirkland and a few others, have made a lot of changes to their building codes over the last few years. But the terminology is talking about taking a piece of property that may have an existing home on it, or a home that you're going to build on it, that would be considered the primary residence or the main residence of the property. And then typically behind it or connected to it, you have the ability to attach another dwelling unit or two. In Seattle, they allow up to 3 units on a single family lot. And so the ADU, or an AADU, means an attached accessory dwelling unit. It's a separate permitted dwelling unit that has a certificate of occupancy issued, and it'd be attached to the primary. And then the third dwelling unit can either be another attached, so that you have all 3 attached, or it could be detached, which would be typically in a spot of the property where there's space to do that, a lot of times in the rear yards or against an alley. And that would be called a DADU, which is a detached accessory dwelling unit.
So how does that make it different than just subdividing? Because we always hear about subdivision. Why? What's the difference between one versus the other?
Yeah, so the traditional subdivision process, particularly around Seattle and so forth, you might hear the terminology of a short plat or short subdivision, which is 9 lots or less that are divided, requires the zoning to allow for a minimum lot size. And in Seattle, historically, 5,000 square feet has been the smallest size, and a lot of folks only have 5,000 or 6,000 square feet. So the ability to subdivide, they just don't have the amount of space or area needed to be able to do that. Whereas with the detached and attached dwelling units, the ADUs and the DADUs, the building permit process allows you to build those on the site as one development site. And the city views the site as one development site. And so the ability to separate or divide is not a typical subdivision. It's done through the condominium process.
So timing wise, how does that impact first going through the subdivision process?
Yeah, well, the subdivision process, when you go through that in its formal sense with the city, you're dealing with a separate application, planning review, zoning review. The minimum lot sizes are looked at, the new lot lines and setbacks, and all of that's looked at. Whereas with this, you're talking about just a building permit to build an accessory dwelling unit, either attached or detached, on a property where the city is just looking at it from a building permit standpoint, which is a much faster process. The city has a lot of stock plans now that have been approved previously that are now part of their inventory or their library that you can select from. They're pre-approved. So the building process is much faster. And then the subdivision or the condominiumization of the property to allow for separate ownership is not reviewed by the city. It's handled by the surveyor and the attorney.
Great. Well, I know you've been working on this, so kind of walk us through some of the projects or process of it, if you could go a little more in detail with us.
Yeah, so the surveying and the legal parts of it are what create a condominium. There's a recording of a map or a drawing. So whether you have an attached dwelling unit or a detached, most folks, when they think about condominiums, they think about it in terms of like a traditional stacked condominium that's comprised of the internal walls or floors and ceilings as it were in a traditional stacked kind of an arrangement. Whereas these are a little different. They look more and feel more like a traditional subdivision because oftentimes there's a detached building and the unit for the condominium, which is kind of like the lot line or the unit line, could be in the middle of the backyard where it separates the two dwelling units in such a way that you have your own yard and parking area, driveway, bicycle storage, EV station for your car. All that kind of stuff can be within the actual unit, including the structure itself. So the unit's not comprised of the building structure so much, but it's comprised of the land around it as well. So we have the condominium creation process, which involves the recording of a map and the filing of a declaration, is part of a new code that went into effect back in 2018. The folks in the legal community and the survey community often refer to the code as WCIWA, which stands for the Washington Uniform Common Interest Ownership Act. And fancy name to just say that there's now an umbrella code that took formerly what was under separate codes for condominiums and separate codes for what was for subdivisions, and now puts everything under one umbrella code. And that's helpful because the terminology that's used, the code references that are cited, are all under one umbrella now, and it helps erase some of the stigma or the lines that separated the understandings of the types of communities that you create. So the condominium now is beginning to look more and more like a typical subdivision in many of these cases, and we're finding it to bear out in the marketplace that folks buy what they see. And if they have a unit line that creates their yard and their building, and it's technically a condominium on paper, but it feels like a subdivision to them, they really don't know the difference. And in large respect, there really isn't a lot of difference. But the condominium itself, the creation of that is created by the map and the declaration. And so there are a few things that the condominium process brings in that a normal subdivision normally doesn't. Primarily, a condominium has a homeowners association. And when you have a homeowners association, you also have the owners acting as board members and officers carrying out the duties of the homeowners association. So it's one of the things about a condominium that's distinguished from a typical subdivision, although a lot of subdivisions also have HOAs. And in that regard, they're going to have a lot of the same kinds of formalities in terms of board members and an HOA and some of the administrative work that's involved with keeping that, moving forward and keeping it up to date. So the elements of a condominium, this is slide number 2 on the PowerPoint. We've got the condominium is a fairly simple process to understand if you think about it in light of really only 3 things that are created in a condominium. Either you have a unit which is the unit that an owner owns, somewhat analogous to a parcel or a lot in a normal subdivision. And then you have limited common elements, which are kind of similar to what easements are on a subdivision, where you have an area that is shared by more than one of the owners, but not necessarily all of the owners. And then you have a common element area, which, like a limited common element area, the common element area would be shared by everybody. And other than easements that may have been created for various reasons, either before or after the condominium, really the condominium is comprised of just those three things. And when you look at a map or read through a declaration about what is a condominium, you're looking at either a unit, a common element, or a limited common element. I've got a slide here that shows a typical type of project that we might see throughout the city, which contains in this case, a very creative thing that many owners will do, which is to take an older house that may be small already, maybe around 1,000 square feet, and they'll constitute that house, the existing house, as the detached accessory dwelling unit, and go in and get a building permit for a duplex type structure that technically is being defined or characterized by the city as a primary and an attached dwelling unit. And the older house then being characterized as a detached dwelling unit. And there you get your three units on the property, one that's considered a primary, one that's considered attached, kind of like a duplex, and then one that's detached. And then areas in blue are showing those graphical areas that would be considered part of the unit. And the unit then between the duplex would share a common wall between the two units there. But other than that, they include yard areas as well. And then the detached unit has its own yard and parking and so forth. But there are also then two other color coded there, the yellow area, which would be the common element shared by everybody. That'd be the walkways, courtyards, things that the whole community as a whole would want to share and use.
So when we did one of these in Renton years ago, and we came up with a limited common element, I mean, unlike you think about a condominium where you own, the paint inside, you can actually have a little bit of a yard around your unit to fence in for a little bit of private space that would go with your unit, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, and that's the beauty of these attached and detached dwelling unit type arrangements, is that the units don't end at the limits of your walls or ceilings, and then everything outside of that is not necessarily a shared area for everyone's use like a traditional condominium. This is more like a subdivision in the sense that the unit is comprised of, as you said, the yard, and there might be barbecue area and outdoor play area, other things like that you design to have included in the unit. And so the unit is comprised of the dwelling unit itself. It's part of the unit, but all these other elements or components are also part of that ownership. And then lastly, the parking, as you mentioned, and some other types of things that, depending on the project, may be considered a limited common element, in that they are not a part of the unit itself, but they are not for everyone's use. And you think about a site in a subdivision, for example, a city will look at things like pedestrian access and vehicular access, parking areas, garbage storage areas throughout the week, or staging areas at the day of pickup, address signs and mailbox sign areas. There's any number of site elements that help a particular community function properly. And normally that's looked at in the subdivision process. So here with the condominium creation, we want to think through all of the kinds of things that would be considered if it was a normal subdivision, to make sure that we've addressed those things. So at the end of the day, you want the site to feel and function as efficiently and comfortably for all the owners as it would if it had gone through a subdivision process.
When you brought up parking, so I heard someone once say, form follows function and function follows parking. So parking is often a tough one to get around for other types of projects. Is there a parking requirement with ADUs and DADUs?
Not typically, and some would contend that there needs to be more consideration for parking, but remembering that the city looks at this as one development site. So while we're talking about condominiumizing ownership of these units so that they can be owned by different individuals, the city, from a development standpoint, is viewing the property as one overall development site. And so typically, if you've got an existing home, it either had or didn't have parking. You might have a garage already or a parking area, and you might retain that for that house. But then when you create the attached dwelling unit or detached dwelling unit, typically there'll just be street parking for that. But again, this is a condominium process we're talking about. And because of that, it's all privatized in terms of it's not reviewed by the city outside the building permit. So if the developer or owner would like to add stalls in order to make it function easier for even though it wasn't required by the permitting process, we oftentimes will add parking. As you can see in the slides here, there's 3 parking stalls, 1 for each unit, but those weren't necessarily required by the permitting process. It's just that we have space for them. A lot of times if there's an alleyway or a rear access day, that's a comfortable place that can accommodate for that kind of an element. And we'll add that to the condominium, even though it wasn't a permit requirement.
Got it. Thanks.
Yep. Well, oftentimes we also get asked, how long does the condominium process take and what's involved? And I mentioned that there's the surveyor prepares a map and the lawyer prepares the declaration and other governing documents. The time that it takes really is more driven by getting your building permit. And in the case of an attached dwelling unit where there is a common wall, the code requires that the structure be substantially completed so that the surveyor can measure to the improvements that have been built. But in the case of a detached accessory dwelling unit, if you have a primary structure and a detached and there's no shared wall, you don't have to have the structure built or even substantially built because the surveyor only needs to certify to the dimensions that are drawn on the survey map, because those dimensions in the units that are being created are being driven by simply lines on a map rather than by constructed elements as in a traditional condominium or a shared wall sense. So time frame is actually fairly quick, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of our clients like to utilize the condominium process is they don't have to go through a separate subdivision process. And some would critique that, well, if you're not going through the subdivision process, you're not getting the oversight and the review by the city to divide and consider impacts to the neighborhood, things like that. But the reality is that when you go through the building permit process and address all of the zoning issues in the building code process, whether you rented those units out to with one landlord owning the entire site to different folks, literally your mother-in-law, that kind of a thing, versus if you allow them to be owned separately, the impact should really be the same. They're dwelling units that are going to be lived in potentially by families. And whether they're under one ownership or each person owns their own, you could argue that when they're owned by individuals who own their own units, there oftentimes will be an additional pride of ownership that will be a better impact to the neighborhood even than if it was just rented out. So, but time-wise, it's really a faster and more streamlined process because you're removing the actual subdivision process from the jurisdictional review and you're handling it through the surveying and the legal side. And so as quickly as your surveyor and your attorney can get paperwork put together and recorded, that's how long it takes to do a condominium.
So let's step back there for a minute. So someone wants to do an accessory dwelling unit or a DADU. They don't need to do the condo association, but what's the benefit of it and why might someone consider doing that in addition to doing just getting a permit for an ADU?
Yeah, that's a good question too. And we actually have a lot of calls from folks who already went through that process, as you mentioned, and they just built a DADU or an ADU. Now that they've got that already in place and maybe they're renting it out or just keeping it as an investment for the future. And they'll ask that same question. What's the benefit of going through this process? Well, if you take a look at the value of a piece of property that is considered one site that has a primary structure and a dwelling unit, either attached or detached, and you look at the market value, fair market value for the property as a whole as one, versus the separating of the dwelling units into condominium units that can be owned by different individuals, and you give their own fair market value for each dwelling unit, what you'll find is it'll make several $100,000s of difference in the overall value of the property to the owner. And also, as you mentioned earlier, in terms of finding sustainable, affordable housing and so forth, while it does improve the fair market value of the units as individual units versus as a whole under one property, it also from a new construction standpoint, is oftentimes less expensive for buyers in the market to be able to afford to buy a smaller 2-bedroom new detached or attached dwelling unit than it would for them to try to find a 2 or 3 bedroom townhome or a standalone newly built single family home, which could be several $100,000 more expensive for the buyers. So it helps the seller and the buyer in that regard.
So buyers who can't afford it can get in maybe cheaper with a unit. And I saw on the City of Seattle's website that this is part of their racial equity toolkit that they're actually kind of promoting. So, I mean, an existing landowner, may have had their home, maybe it's mom and dad's home. They want to keep them there, but they want to create some equity into it. They can maybe build an ADU, DADU, sell off those others to be able to help keep mom and dad in the unit or raise some equity to be able to help cover other costs.
Absolutely. That's another great benefit. Is I mentioned earlier, a lot of folks have been priced out of their neighborhood in terms of both property taxes and home values and just expenses generally, as the housing market boom has caused a lot of folks to not be able to afford to live where they've traditionally lived, or maybe they've got a home that's been in the family for generations and they'd like to stay in the community. The condominiumization of the attached dwelling unit or detached dwelling unit gives a lot of options to that owner, who can then decide if they want to sell the old family home and maybe keep the new construction that they did as their own unit. They can capture the value of the sale of the primary unit and move into the ADU or the DADU and have a brand newly constructed, separately owned property that's still right there on the same plot of land that they have had in their family for generations. Or they can build the brand new construction for the ADU or the DADU and sell those off and use that to pay off their mortgage, or if they've already got their mortgage paid down, they can use the profits in other ways and keep their old home on the property after selling off their backyard that maybe they're not using. So it provides some flexibility and options. The other option is they could develop this as condominium units and also rent them out. Just because it's been turned into a condominium doesn't mean you have to sell the units. But folks might want to decide to create rental revenue streams by building and renting. So it provides all those options for folks that are already living and owning properties in the city and looking for ways that maybe historically they had looked into subdividing and realized they couldn't do anything with their property in that way. But now with the ADU and DADU condominiumization type of scheme, they can figure out how to use one of those strategies that would benefit them moving forward. So graphically, we've depicted here 3 different sort of typical types of projects that we will see throughout the city over the last couple of years under the new zoning codes and under the new Wakaiwa codes in the state. And so starting from the left and kind of working towards the right, you can kind of see your basic division through the condominium to create 2 units that are detached. This would be where you'd have a primary and a detached that does not share any constructed walls. And so a line literally through the middle of the property there that basically carves the north half and the south half of the properties in such a way that both owners have their own detached structures within their unit. And they both have their own parking area, their own yard areas. Very straightforward, very clean, and a very efficient design to something that creates a sort of autonomous, similar feeling to what a normal subdivision would feel like. And then in our middle diagram there, we'll see the other type of scenario that we often see, where we'll have a primary and a attached that are almost looking like a duplex kind of an arrangement, where they share a party wall or some other form of attachment that technically characterizes them as being attached. So an attached dwelling unit, and therefore the line would go through that part of the building that's attached and create separate units in that way. Although the rest of it still may have a yard and be like the first diagram, in one sense, it's going to have a shared area that's constructed as an attachment. And then a detached structure again, so a total of 3 units, 2 of which have a shared wall. And in that diagram, you'll also see that there typically would be a walkway area that might be a limited common element or common element, where all the owners would have the ability to go from the alley to the street, for example, and use a walkway that each of them would be responsible for maintaining. And then you have your parking areas as well that you might consider limited common elements and assign those accordingly based on the needs. And then on the right-hand side, we're seeing some creative designs that will occur when a developer may purchase 2 adjoining properties. And since you can do 3 units on each lot, if you have 2 that are next to one another, you might decide to go ahead and build 3 units with the building plan and then merge the 2 sites as a total of 6 units in one project in terms of a condominium, even though it went through building permit processes individually. We'll see this also in the RSL zone, which is a newer zone in the city of Seattle that allows different type of density and minimum size than what the traditional single family 5,000 type zone did. But in any event, by combining that space either with 2 adjoining lots or having a parcel large enough for the density to fit additional units, you can see how 4 or 5 units may fit into a project that way. You could have 2 separate side-by-side lots that you own in the city where you do 2 on one and 3 on the other. And because the condominium is separate and autonomous from what you're doing at the city, then you're kind of free to come up with a creative design that works for you. And here we've got our units all detached there with the common element areas and parking areas laid out to kind of give you an idea of what a scheme like that could look like.
And that's similar. I'm helping an estate right now with something similar where they have 2 adjoining lots, 2 existing homes, and the estate's trying to realize the maximum value for the heirs and looking at different options like this.
Yes.
I heard that if just 5% of the lots within the residential zone were to go through an ADU process, it could create an additional 4,000 housing units. That's, again, doesn't solve any crisis or issues, but yet it contributes. It's a part of the toolkit to do this. So, I went back to the beginning of it. I said you're unique in your background and with your law firm and how you help. Tell us more about you and your background and how you're helping builders and developers and individuals and estates and property owners get through the process.
Yeah, definitely cut my teeth in a unique way in this industry because working in a land surveying civil engineering firm and then taking over that firm and helping clients through the permitting process, I got a lot of exposure to what it takes to do subdivisions, what it takes to do condominiums, what it takes to do boundary line adjustments, to reconfigure parcels that may in their reconfigured design may yield a better design in return for the things we've been talking about here today on a different layout for the lot lines than maybe what they currently look like. And also older grandfather lots or historical lots that maybe somebody owns and doesn't even realize that they've already got 2 lots or more. And since whatever you're starting with could potentially have up to 3 of these units on it, it's important to look at the highest and best value of your property in terms of what is actually there. What do you own? Do you own 1 of something? Do you own 2 of something? Is there a way that you could get from 1 to 2 and then use these concepts we're talking about here to get 3 or 2 or 3 more units on each of those? So there's a lot of things in my background in the land surveying side and just going through title reports and legal descriptions and permits that became the foundation for what then when I became a real estate attorney, what I kind of work that I would do to help a lot of owners and developers with these similar types of processes. And then over these last few years, it's really all come to a whole new level because of these, what I kind of consider, if you can get it permitted, we can condominiumize it. So if you can get dwelling units approved by the jurisdiction that you're in, the condominium is a totally separate privatized matter between the surveyor and the lawyer, both of our hats that I have and do wear. So it's a unique vantage point, and it allows our firm too to also think about, since these are projects that are privately done and nobody is really reviewing them outside of the attorney and the surveyor, is to use all the wealth of knowledge I have in the last 26 years of doing these to make sure that even if things aren't required by the code for the permit, that we think about them in the creation of these communities so that at the end of the day, the folks that are buying these units have a comfortable layout and have design elements that work well for them.
Great. So if people wish to connect with you, what's the best way for them to do so?
Well, you can call Wilson Law Group of Washington, 206-805-6238, or visit our website, www.wilsonlawgroupwa.com, and happy to talk to you with any questions you might have.
Yeah, and thanks for coming on, because again, as the city has this as a racial equity toolkit item in ways that I think that just a lot of people who have lived in Seattle for a long time may have, value their equity in their property that they don't know about. So before just choosing to sell mom or dad's home or choosing to, sell the house, maybe there's something more that they can recapture themselves, or small time developers, investors can get in on this too. So there's just a lot of ways to, again, increase the housing stock and affordability within the city of Seattle or Washington as a whole. So I think there's a great value and service to having this option out there. So thanks for coming on today and sharing more of your experience.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.